Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the Botanix Shareholder Update webinar this morning. The call will be hosted by the Botanix leadership team, who will run through a presentation to provide more detail following the announcement that was released to ASX this morning. Participants will then be able to ask questions, and we will endeavour to answer as many as possible. For those who are unable to attend, the call is being recorded and will be made available on the website shortly. So I'll now hand over to you, Matt, to begin. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks to all of the attendees attending here at short notice. Unfortunately, we had to wait until the ASX put the announcement up on the platform to give you the details of the webinar this morning. So we've got close to 100 that are joining now at short notice, so thank you for that. I'm going to hand over to Vince Ippolito, Executive Chairman, in a minute to introduce and take us through the announcement this morning. Just as a matter of housekeeping, there is a button down the bottom of your Zoom called Q&A. So please use that to post questions for us to answer. During the course of the presentation and at the end of the presentation, we will endeavour to get through as many of those questions as possible. And I'll now hand it over to Vince just to introduce the panelists and to provide an introduction, obviously recognising that folks would not have had a lot of time this morning to go through the announcement itself. So Vince, over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Matt. For those of you that are joining us here this morning and have not had the benefit of the announcement, what we're going to cover here in just a handful of slides for you was a communication we received from the FDA late Friday after business hours in the US, which would be your Saturday morning in Australia, called a complete response letter. And in that complete response letter, the agency identified one issue relative to clarification on patient use instructions. So the real purpose of this presentation and panel today is to really take you through what the implications of that complete response letter is, and then the delay associated with this and the action steps that the company will be taking to quickly answer the FDA's questions. So Matt, why don't we go to slide 3 here, and let me just introduce everyone that's on the call here that'll be speaking. Many of you have heard before from our Chief Executive Officer, Howie McKibbon. He's joining us today. You heard from Matt Callahan, our founder and executive director. Also joining us on the call here and available for questions is Dr. Bill Bosch, director and board member at Botanix, and Dr. Patty Walker, chief medical advisor, who many of you have heard from before. We have a special guest that is joining us here today for your benefit and who's been working feverishly with the company over the weekend here on this complete response letter. Dave Clissold. Dave is a director at Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara. Dave has a very broad-based experience in the pharmaceutical, biotech, medical device, food, dietary supplement fields as it relates to advising clients on regulatory and legislative matters relative to the FDA. His law firm is the largest dedicated FDA law firm in the United States. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say there's probably nothing that Dave and his firm hasn't seen relative to the FDA. What makes Dave especially unique here in his skill set is that he provides guidance also to pharmaceutical companies like Botanix along the whole product life cycle. That means from drug development, clinical trials, advertising and promotion. He really understands our business very well from a legal and regulatory perspective. He is a well sought after lecturer on topics relative to the FDA and is well published in several journals and articles such as the New England Journal of Medicine. So Dave, first off, welcome, and you'll be hearing from him shortly here. Matt, why don't we go to the next slide then? Apologies if some of our voices are a little raspy here as you're going to be hearing from us. So hopefully it's not too distracting for all of you. So the announcement that's out on the web, as Matt had indicated, the press release and a copy of this presentation is discussing the letter that we received from the FDA on clarification relative to instructions for use. And that complete response letter, when we talk about instructions for use, that is the instructions that are often contained in a prescription product on how to use the product. They're the printed materials that come in the product, or sometimes they're included on the package themselves. Now, you can imagine we were quite disappointed on Friday when we received this complete response letter from the FDA relative to instructions for use and the potential delay that sits in front of us here. We had gone so far and so long with the agency along this way, and our disappointment was immense. But when we stepped back from the letter, the good news that we saw in all of this is that the agency had no clinical efficacy, safety, or pharmacology issues that they raised. No non-clinical or manufacturing issues were also raised in the letter, and no additional clinical studies are going to be required by the FDA to support the NDA approval. No new review issues are anticipated as part of the resubmission review, and the requested activities, we believe, can be quickly addressed, accelerating our potential approval here in the not too distant future. And you'll see when we go through the details of that letter and the request, I think you'll share our confidence in that. So Botanix will meet with the FDA and undertake the minor activities and plans to resubmit the FDA. That will be targeted in early Q1 2024, with a target approval now in mid-2024. The company is well funded to complete the resubmission, and with the anticipated delay in launch, as we've originally communicated, which was going to be in Q1 of 2024, it'll be about a 3 to 6 month delay in that approval and launch, and with no change in the target opportunity that we see for Sofpironium Bromide for the treatment of primary axillary hyperhidrosis. So with that, why don't I turn it over to Dave, and he'll take you through a greater understanding of the complete response letters and some of the implications of that then. So Dave, please.
Thank you, Vince. Thank you also for that very kind introduction. And thank you to Vince, Matt, Patty, the entire Botanix team for inviting me to participate with you today. So I first want to talk about what a complete response letter is. A complete response letter is the agency's communication to the sponsor that FDA cannot approve a submitted new drug application in its present form. And it describes any areas that must be addressed before the application can be approved. It's important to note that the sponsor doesn't see a copy of the complete response letter and does not have the opportunity to communicate freely with FDA outside the standard meeting schedule. So mid-cycle review meetings, late cycle review meetings, et cetera, or a formal meeting request, which is usually a type B meeting, sometimes a type C meeting, but a type B meeting can be 60 days prior notice. The regulation describing the content of a complete response letter is provided on this slide. The regulations also offer an opportunity for an end of review meeting, which is attended by senior FDA personnel. This is classified as a type A meeting by FDA, meaning that FDA has 30 days from the request to grant and hold that meeting. So we'll talk a little bit later about the company's plans regarding that type A meeting, but I just wanted to outline what that is. Next slide, please. Here, I've outlined sort of the issues that we have seen in lots of other CRLs. And we start at the top with the riskiest and most expensive and most delay associated with a complete response letter that brings up issues of safety or clinical safety or clinical efficacy or the risk-benefit ratio. And I say those are the riskiest because generally those will require another randomized clinical trial in order to meet FDA's concerns. sometimes a longer-term safety trial, but the point is they are expensive and time-consuming to conduct those types of issues. Next are pharmacology non-clinical issues. Again, if FDA wants to see a reproductive toxicology study in rabbits, that can take a while. Carcinogenicity, of course, can take up to a year or two. We don't have that in this issue. Manufacturing issues are another thing that we see in other complete response letters that can cause delay and expense. Let's say FDA has a question about the quality of the product related to the way it's manufactured. And so now you've got to worry about changing your way of manufacturing, perhaps to get rid of an impurity or other issue that FDA has raised. That can cause a lot of delay and expense. In contrast, what we have in this complete response letter is one issue, and it's related to the instructions for use and other material facing the patient. So that is probably the least risky type of issue that can be raised in a complete response letter. And I know the company will be talking about its plans to address that issue in later slides.
Thanks, Hannah. I'll take, pardon me, the next couple of slides here. Again, apologies for voices. We managed to contract COVID over the weekend as well. So just going to talk about instructions for use, kind of what they are and what specifically FDA has asked us to do. So as Vince kind of mentioned at the start, the instructions for use are usually a single, maybe two pieces of paper that are included in the product carton. In our case, we have a box, the product carton, and into that goes those instructions for use, which contain step-by-step, often graphical instructions as to how to use and apply the product. So these instructions for use go through multiple iterations. They are also tested in what they call human factors studies. So you bring in volunteers, they read the instructions, you video them applying the drug after following those instructions, and you check to see whether your instructions are clear. Okay, so not very complex at all. FDA goes through these instructions as part of the label review, and their job obviously is to make sure that someone doesn't apply it in their eye, someone follows the instructions to wash their hands as an example, and they understand how to operate the device that's being used to dispense the drug. Next slide. Thanks, Hannah. So what have we been asked to do? So the diagram on the left-hand side is a graphical diagram taken from our instructions for use that show all the components in our product. So it has a cap, it has an applicator, and it has a pump. You pump the gel onto the applicator, you apply that under your arms, you wash the applicator, and you put the pump back on. Okay, I just said that in 25 words or less. Because not everyone is as clever as everyone else, we have to provide very graphical, very straightforward instructions. And the document up the top of the slide here is an example of our instructions for use. So the letter that we received from FDA on Friday afternoon said specifically, can you label that plastic applicator with the word applicator? They also asked us to reformat those instructions. So instead of running horizontally or in landscape format and folded accordingly, they'd like them to run vertically or in portrait format and be folded accordingly. They also want the statement, wash hands with soap and water immediately after use, placed on the outside of the carton and on the bottle prominently. They are already there if you can read the very small writing, but they would like that more prominently. Once we have made those minor drafting and formatting changes, they want us to conduct a human factors study to demonstrate that those revised instructions can still be followed appropriately. I should mention that the document that you see up the top is about the 6th draft of the instructions for use, and they have been through human factors studies already, and they've already been reviewed by the FDA prior to us submitting the NDA itself. And we'll talk in the course of the discussion about kind of why this isn't finished during the review period and also, of course, what these changes actually mean from a timing perspective. Next slide, please, Hannah. And I'll hand over to Howie to talk a little bit about the timeline and the commercial implications of these changes. Thanks, Howie.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Just to reiterate, we're obviously very disappointed, as I'm sure you are, to get this news, but for them to get it at this point, because we feel that there are things that we could have done with this information had we had it sooner. That said, we're focused on getting to resubmission as quickly as possible, number one, and number two, decreasing the time to revenue generation. And what you're going to see in this timeline, in addition to the plan that we're setting forth, is that the actual commercial launch of Sofpironium Bromide is only going to be delayed 3 to 6 months. Now let's talk to how that's going to occur. We have the end of review meeting with the FDA. As soon as we signal that we want this meeting, they have 30 days with which to meet with us. We will have the opportunity to meet with them live, face to face, to go over what our plan is to get to resubmission and ultimately approval for Sofpironium Bromide. During that time period and afterward, we'll be finalizing the revised instructions for use. Those are all the things that Matt said in the previous slides, in addition to any feedback that we might get from the agency. Now, the part that does take time here is conducting the human factor study. It's not a lot of time, but it's something that we do have to conduct in order to ensure that the agency has proof that these instructions for use actually do what they're intended to do. And I would just like to reiterate here that it's not an overtly complex study. Right? This is not a clinical study. It's not an animal study. It's just a study to ensure that the individuals can follow the directions. It's not unlike ensuring that child-proof caps work. They simply put a bunch of children in a room with the caps and find out whether they can open them or not. We will have to collate those data and then update our package and then resubmit that to the agency. We believe that we can do that in the next couple of months here. The agency does get a 6 month review, and that puts us right about mid-year of 2024 for approval. And if you recall, we spoke multiple times about the fact that with a September approval, we would need a couple of weeks to not just finalize packaging, but to put the product into bottles, et cetera. And once we completed that or those activities, we would be bumping up against the holidays, right? It's Thanksgiving, it's Christmas. It's a very difficult time with which to have sales representatives, sales professionals start new jobs. And we certainly didn't want to pay them to sit at home for 2 weeks at Christmas and a week at Thanksgiving. The timing of this resubmission actually plays in our favor because at mid-year, we then have the opportunity to launch the product from a digital and telemedicine perspective, but also potentially with sales reps, because you are getting your start, your ramp up, and your launch runway well before the holiday season. And that's something that we certainly would take advantage of with regard to that extra time, not only to plan, but to execute. So the takeaway here is there's a number of activities that we have to engage in the next couple of months. They're not overtly complicated. We just need to ensure we execute well. They're not overtly expensive. We have cash runway to get us past the resubmission and ultimately approval of Sofpironium Bromide here. And ultimately, it's going to delay us 3 to 6 months with regard to time to revenue generation. Next slide, please. And we spoke to this, and I'll say this again, and we'll post this meeting, give you constant updates that track back to that timeline that we just showed. But the delay caused by resubmission is likely to be 3 to 6 months. Just want to reiterate here that, again, no clinical efficacy, safety, pharmacology, non-clinical or manufacturing issues were raised. And as you saw on that continuum that Dave showed earlier, those were the more difficult, complex, risky, and time-consuming activities, certainly compared to instructions for use. Our market's not going to change unless, of course,
it gets marginally bigger over time because the U.S. population grows. But the 3.7 million patients that are currently seeking treatment in the physician offices are those that we will target with our sales professionals. And the 6.3 million other patients who are not in the doctor's office but actively searching online for solutions are those that we will target via telemedicine in our digital program. We have the potential now not just to take advantage of the extra time to plan, but also to execute and launch soon after the approval of mid-year 2024. And just to reiterate here, we're funded to reach the new approval date. We'll certainly adjust, as always, our operating costs and commercial spend to ensure that runway exists, but it's something that we've been doing and will continue to do with regard to being judicious with the dollars that have been placed under our charge. So I'll pause there. I know there's likely to be a number of questions here, and Matt will moderate that section for us. Thank you, Matt.
All right, thanks, Howie. Thanks, Hannah. So we've got a pile of questions flowing in here, so we'll get to as many of those as we can. We're going to have about 20 minutes at the end here for questions, and I think we can probably address hopefully at least a lot of them. I'm going to start with you, Vince, if you don't mind taking this question. So the question's about, you mentioned disappointment in relation to receiving this letter. Were you expecting a pretty straightforward approval of the NDA?
Yeah. So given the strength and this is a very good question. Thank you for asking it. The strength of the clinical efficacy and safety data. I mean, that's the main reason we purchased this product, because the trials were conducted so well that leading into the approval here, we were fairly confident, and the agency had raised no issues relative to safety, efficacy, manufacturing, as you heard before, which are the things, as you saw in the presentation, that could really delay you. So our disappointment really came in on Friday when it boiled down to an instruction for use in the delay here. Now, again, I want to reiterate, after we stepped back from this, we were pleased to see that there was nothing more than that. And as you've seen from the presentation, the action steps that Howie has laid out in the presentation to rectify this quickly, we feel confident that we'll be able to move through this issue and engage the agency.
Thanks, Vince. Question here from Jonathan, which is in relation to instructions for use being such a minor issue. Why weren't these instructions addressed as part of the review process? So maybe Dave, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Obviously we don't have insight into what happened during this NDA review, but you're right. These sorts of things are normally addressed during the review cycle. I will note that FDA believes that the changes will require a human factors study. So we intend to get some more clarity at the Type A meeting over exactly what the issues are. And again, as was pointed out in the presentation, the specific changes that will make this resubmission complete. The usual process is you get information requests as the review proceeds about issues identified during the review of the NDA, and the sponsor has a short period of time to respond in detail to those specific individual information requests. And in fact, Botanix received several information requests during the review and promptly responded on every occasion. The divisions are broken into different disciplines, and those disciplines will have their own meetings during the review, and then they all come together in the mid-cycle review meeting where the division communicates to the sponsor if there's anything critical at that stage that would hold up approval. And Botanix's mid-cycle meeting was very clean, and no critical issues were identified. So it's unusual that a sponsor would get all the way to the end of the review and have an issue like this with no sort of discussion along the way, whether labeling changes during the review could have resolved the issue. But that's where we are. I was also surprised that the review ended this way.
Thanks, Dave. A question here from Dev, which is what changes do we need to make to the instructions for use, and how do we know that those changes will satisfy the FDA? So maybe I'll take that one. So as we set out in the press release and indeed in the deck, the quotes that we put in there are the exact wording of what FDA has asked us to do. And it sounds pretty simple, adding words about washing your hands to a carton and, doing things like changing the way that the thing folds. But that's what FDA wants us to do, and that's what we will do in the interest of getting this thing approved as quickly as possible. We've actually started doing that. As we mentioned before, we're able to get Dave Clissold working on this over the weekend. Thanks, Dave. And in the last 24 hours, we've been able to actually work on a revised instructions for use to reformat that as we've done and to review it. We will be working with our external experts to make sure that those revisions are appropriate. And we have the opportunity to discuss this with the FDA. So when we go back for our end of review meeting, as Dave mentioned, we will be talking specifically about our redraft of the document and the study design that we intend to use to validate those instructions for use. So to the point of, how do we know that we're going to do the right thing? Well, the FDA is going to tell us, and they'll give us guidance around both the instructions as we've drafted them, but also the design of the human factors study to make sure that we're doing that appropriately. So there's a couple of questions here from Tanu about the actual protocol itself, the design of the study. So the human factors validation study, just so folks are aware, generally involves about 40 usually healthy volunteers. They come into a room, they get given a copy of the instructions for use, they get to read it. They are monitored then with a bottle and a cap and an applicator to see how they actually follow those instructions and whether they can follow them accurately. And then a report is done off the back of that, which essentially identifies whether they were able to follow those instructions and whether they are clear, and what changes need to be made for the instructions for use. So it's not done with healthcare providers. It's not done with certain age groups of people. It's done with general users representative of the age group that would be using the product. So we have already identified the company that can run these studies, and we also have identified where it can be done and when it can be done, and that's reflected in the timeline that we've put up already. So just back to questions here. There's a couple of questions here from Michael and from Graham, which are in relation to whether the timing of the resubmission and whether it costs money to do it. So maybe Dave, if you want to take this one, does it cost more money or any money to resubmit the NDA? And is there a chance that it can take longer than 6 months?
Right. So Botanix is a small business, so it has a waiver from the user fees, and that also applies to the resubmission. So no, there won't be any fee for the resubmission. So why 6 months? Under the PDUFA law and regulations, complete responses, a company's response to a complete response letter gets a little confusing, but a complete response to a complete response letter can be classified as either type 1 or type 2. Type 1 can be reviewed in 2 months. This will likely be a type 2 resubmission, again, because of the human factors study, primarily that FDA will need to do. And so FDA is committed under its agreements with Congress to complete those types of resubmission reviews within 6 months. Can they do faster? Sure, they can. But usually they take the full 6 months. And so, again, it's just a standard that is established under the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, PDUFA. You can think of it as the same as when the goal date for an original submission, the NDA submission. In this case, it was 12 months. And it's just a way for FDA to be measured and staff to be measured in compliance with those user fee goal dates.
All right. you on a roll, Dave. So I've got another one for you. A question from Michael in relation to the resubmission of the NDA. Can FDA come up with new reasons to reject the NDA once you've filed the resubmission, assuming that you get the instructions right?
Okay, so a complete response is just that. It means FDA has completely reviewed a new drug application and has identified the issues that prevent approval. Our complete response letter, Botanix's complete response letter, mentioned the one issue that we've been talking about all presentation. So yeah, assuming that your resubmission satisfies FDA that patients actually can understand and follow these new instructions. I mean, the idea that there would be something new that would affect that. I mean, one possibility is, so the answer to that is yes, but it's extremely unlikely. It would have to be based on some sort of new information that FDA became aware of since the time it conducted the complete review. One example I'm familiar with is some clinical studies were ongoing, and there was a safety issue that happened during those clinical studies. So it was new in the sense that it wasn't part of the original NDA, but it did become an issue during the review of the resubmission. Here, Botanix has no clinical trials ongoing, so I think the chances of such a event are very, very small.
Right. Another question here from Sam, which kind of goes back to, I think, some of the points you made in the presentation, Dave, if you want to take this. So can you kind of compare the complexity of a human factors instruction for use style study with, say, an efficacy study in terms of level of complexity and risk?
Yeah, I mean, I've reviewed a lot of complete response letters over the years, and the ones that cause major delay and major expense are ones that require either an additional clinical study or an additional non-clinical study. Those are just time consuming. You have to get onto a schedule to do those things. You have to have contracts put in place, and then the studies themselves can take, well, months or even years to complete before you get the answer that FDA is looking for. That's very different than a human factors study. Matt, I think, summarize those beautifully. That's about 40 patients. The company's actually done them before as part of the development of the original instructions for use. And so they are relatively much shorter, much less expensive. Yeah, I mean, anything else?
That's great. I think that I want to get on to we've got some commercialization related questions here, but just to finish off on some of the instructions for use. There's a question here: are the Japanese instructions for the product in Japan, which is called Ecloc, different from the one proposed for SB? The short answer is yes, because they're in Japanese and this is in English. But the way in which the Japanese FDA requires those to be laid out is different. And they would have done their own human factors studies to, in the Japanese way, figure out how to apply the product. So yes, they are different from that point of view. Just a couple of other questions here coming through, and I'll get back to you in a minute, Dave, with a couple more questions. One question raised by Will is, given that this appears to be a relatively simple issue, does this de-risk the company from a big pharma acquisition perspective if it's just the labeling that needs to be attended to? So maybe I'll take that one, and Vince and Howie can kind of disagree, but this is a very simple and straightforward issue. Obviously we will have to spend some time and do this properly and get the resubmission in and completed. It will, as Howie said, delay our commercialization until the approval, which we're targeting for mid next year. So, that is potentially a good time for those guys to kind of see us while we're working and understand that there's one issue to go. Ironically, given the position that we're in on Thursday of last week, waiting for feedback from the FDA, we now have complete clarity as to what we have to do from an approval perspective. So that's a good thing. I'll stop talking because I'm losing my voice, but maybe I'll throw to you, Howie. You've got a couple of questions here in relation to resubmission timetable. You mentioned in the presentation that you expected a delay in revenue generation of about 3 to 6 months, versus what was originally planned. Can you just maybe reiterate and expand on that, please?
Yeah, sure. As you probably recall, our plan following the successful approval of Sofpironium Bromide at the end of September this year was to then complete the work that needed to be done with regard to labeling, cartoning, et cetera, getting the drug to warehouse, setting and communicating pricing, and bringing on the sales force after the Thanksgiving and Christmas breaks. So we've been very steadfast about that, not wanting to have paid these reps to not work over the holidays and lose our opportunity for a steep launch trajectory. So we would sacrifice that time to then go out in February of the following year. Well, now the approval or potential approval timeline is shifted to mid-year of 2024. Well, that puts us July, August timeframe, which is plenty of time with which to ramp up and establish our launch trajectory as we go into the holidays. And that for us is very beneficial. We would prefer to be out sooner than later. It's just very, very difficult to only go in the late fourth quarter. So we have the ability to utilize that time to not only plan, optimize, but also have our telemedicine digital platform ready to go immediately with reps to follow shortly after.
All right, thanks. Question here from Mitch. How sure are you that there's nothing coming down the pipeline that's going to be competitive to a launch before Sofpironium Bromide? Maybe, Howie, do you want to take that one as well?
No, you bet. And this is a quick one. It's something that we monitor, of course, for any products that we have, because it goes toward your development, your resourcing, et cetera, what your strategy is going to be. And we keep track of that on clinicaltrials.gov. And it's something that you could check out yourself as well on clinicaltrials.gov, or any trials that are ongoing in the United States in various therapeutic areas and all therapeutic areas. So we're acutely aware of what's out there, and there's nothing coming down the pipe now that's going to inhibit our launch trajectory or change anything that we're doing. And we are aware of the programs that are there, but have also stalled.
All right, thanks, Howie. Follow-up question to that, maybe on the CapEx, OpEx side. Do you have an idea of how much this study, the human factors study and those related activities are likely to cost, and what sort of impact do you think they're going to have on your runway? Maybe, Howie, if you want to take that one as well.
No, you bet. About $150,000 is what our estimate is. We have two other estimates coming in now just to make sure, but we're in a position now where we're going to earmark the time, for those trials. And you'll probably note in our last Appendix 4E, we had about $10.7 million in cash. We're expecting a R&D tax credit in the next few months. So as a percentage of our total cash, it's very small, the cost of this study. And we're going to continue stage gating our spend as we have in the past, so that we're prepared for things just like this. I'll note in the past year, we didn't pay bonuses to ensure that we were sensible in preserving our cash. We didn't go out and hire sales and marketing leadership or the sales professionals ahead of approval. Otherwise, right now, we'd be in a position where we'd have to reduce our workforce, and there'd be costs associated with that as well. So we're going to continue efficiently managing our expenses with the focus on approval and launch planning with a small team that we do have, and that team will continue to do many of the things themselves. The folks on this call, ensuring they're rolling up their sleeves, conserving cash, so that all dollars we have are focused on the approval and launch preparation, so that we can hit the ground running.
Thanks. We've got time for a few more questions. We've got one here from Will, maybe Howie, again, if you don't mind, which is focused on kind of what work can you continue in advance of approval on the commercial side, and kind of what does that look like getting ready, and does that make you more ready as you head into this approval, given the time that we've had up into the current date?
Yeah, so some of the good news during this time period, we did get a name approved, though we can't announce it yet, and we have completed all of our creative internally. We've done this, so we have materials that are along with training that are going to be used to train the sales reps, and those materials they're going to use to go out and educate dermatologists about the product. What we'll now have is the opportunity to finalize all of the distribution network. So we've signed our key partners, and those key partners are communicating with each other with regard to both telemedicine and distribution through our network of specialty pharmacies. We'll have the ability to not just finalize that, but test it so that we're ready to go immediately post-launch versus 3 months or 4 months post-launch. That was in the original plan. Our manufacturing and stability batches will be ongoing. Validation for those batches will be ongoing, and as a result, we anticipating having product at the appropriate time. So all of these things that are necessary to put us in a position to have the option to launch right away versus taking a couple of months to then launch the product at that time.
Right. So that's a good segue into a question here from Steve, which is focused on manufacturing. You just briefly mentioned that there, Howie, as to whether this delay actually is going to have any effect on products that have been manufactured or committed to manufacture. I think you kind of answered that, but do you want to just expand on that specifically?
No, you bet. All of our batches are on validation right now, and we have 3 batches that are currently being validated. That work is planned to continue, and that turns into our commercial launch supply, of which afterward we start to manufacture, for the next quarter in safety stock, et cetera. Not only that, we have product on stability, and the longer it sits there on stability, the longer of a shelf life we have on our product. So as long as we're not bottling that product yet, we don't start the clock of expiration, number one, and then number two, the longer it sits there, the longer dating that we have. We already have what we believe is going to be 3-year dating. Anything more than that is just a very positive scenario when it comes to having our product, not just at our specialty pharmacy, but in the cabinets of our patients.
Thanks, Howie. Maybe this is kind of the last question, and I think it's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but maybe it's not. So it's a question here to you, Howie, specifically about recently taking the CEO position, and this is obviously not what you expected to step into. How do you feel about this in that position?
Yeah, it's not at all what I expected, given my participation in the entire review. I think we were all very, very surprised to see this, especially at this stage of the game. That said, I took the position with the firm belief that this is an approvable product. It's got a large market potential in a team with an unparalleled track record of success in developing and launching products in medical derm. And that team hasn't lost one yet. And I don't anticipate any of us want to lose one now. So I have no doubt, and I believe the team has no doubt, that we're going to get this product approved and launched successfully. That's how I feel about the decision.
All right, thank you. It's good to hear. Okay, conscious of time here, we've come up to our allotted time. Let me just thank both our panelists and speakers and the board members that have attended the call. Let me also thank Hannah for running the call today and making available the facility. As you've heard, this is a delay that we had not expected, but we have a plan to very rapidly recover the time that we have. And as Howie said, the impact on revenue generation should be nominal, given the size of the opportunity and the speed with which we'll get this thing approved. We remain committed to that. You've got a very committed board and management, and pretty much a lot of the management is here because they are the board. We'll manage our cash very appropriately and efficiently, and we look forward to delivering good news as we go through the approval resubmission and the approval process itself. So let's end it there. Thank you for everyone's attendance. Thank you for the questions. There was a lot of them, and thanks for the support that we have and for that support to continue. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.